Have you ever wondered what the sound of a collapsing world would be like? It isn't a single deafening explosion that ends abruptly. No, it's a symphony of destruction, beginning with distant, rumbling bass notes, the growl of the earth itself that you feel deep in your chest before your ears can even catch it. It's the howl of the wind, sweeping through villages about to be erased from the map, carrying with it the acrid smell of gunpowder and the invisible weight of fear. For tens of thousands of civilians in Quang Tri and the soldiers of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam defending this northern frontier in late March 1972, that was the sound of hell opening its gates. Our story doesn't begin with a date. It begins with a feeling. A quiet unease that crept through every street and every rooftop of the small town of Quang Tri. People spoke of unprecedented troop movements by North Vietnam across the demilitarized zone. They heard of endless convoys of vehicles snaking down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, hidden beneath the forest canopy of the Truong Son Mountains. The McNamara electronic barrier, once hailed as an impenetrable line of defense, had become nothing more than a fragile symbol of a peace about to be torn apart. No one knew when, but everyone knew something terrible was coming. And then it came. March 30th, 1972, Easter Sunday. When the church bells should have rung, the air instead shook with the thunder of thousands of artillery guns. From the Truong Son Mountains, from across the Ben Hai River, from positions no one had expected, a storm of fire and steel rained down. The shelling was so intense that people said you could walk from one outpost to another by jumping across craters. The once peaceful blue sky of Quang Tri turned gray, thick with smoke and ashes overnight. In just 4 days of that fiery storm, the entire front collapsed. 14 outposts, eyes of the border, fell silent, one after another. 3 district headquarters, centers of military and civil command, were abandoned in chaos. This was not merely a military defeat. It was the disintegration of a defense system years in the making. And with it came a humanitarian disaster. Over 50,000 people, from Cam Lo, Hung Hoa, Gio Lin, lands their ancestors had lived on for generations, were forced to leave everything behind. They left family altars, rice fields, and ancestral graves. They became refugees in their own homeland, struggling along Highway 1, the lifeline of the nation, now given a new name, the Highway of Horror. The retreating military convoys merged with fleeing civilians, creating a harrowing scene of panic and despair. As the threat of losing an entire province loomed, shockwaves rippled back to Saigon. On April 2nd, President Nguyen Van Thieu himself flew to Hue. In a tense meeting at the I Corps Command, a sharp order was issued. At all costs, hold the enemy back. That was not just a command. It was a vow to hold the land. A new defensive line was drawn on the map, a thin line that carried the last hope. Dong Ha, Ai Tu, Phuong Hoang, La Vang. Here, the fate of South Vietnam would be decided. To fulfill that vow, Saigon deployed its finest. The skies of central Vietnam roared with the engines of C-130 transport planes. The General Staff ordered the emergency airlift of their elite units. First came the Airborne Division, the Red Berets, angels of the battlefield, but they were soon redirected elsewhere. Then arrived the Marines, the tough Sea Wolves. Under the command of Leutnant Colonel Pham Van Trung, the Marine Division and the 369th Brigade were dropped into My Chang. Their arrival was a massive morale boost for exhausted troops, but it still wasn't enough. The northern offensive was too powerful. Reinforcements were needed, men who could fight under the harshest conditions. So, the C-130s lifted off once more, this time carrying the Tiger Stripes, the elite Rangers. On April 4th, the Ranger Command and 3 mobile, battle-hardened groups, 4th, 5th, and 6th Ranger Groups, landed in Quang Tri. 10,000 soldiers. 10,000 hopes for a dying front. Imagine the scene. The 5th Ranger Group, led by Let Caller Min Hung, had barely set foot at Phu Bai Airfield near Hue before receiving immediate orders to move out that same night. They boarded GMC trucks, heading straight into the darkness of a battlefield none of them had seen before. There was no time to rest, no time to prepare. Only orders and courage. Behind them, the Air Force continued flying through the night, bringing in the rest of the reinforcements. An entire military region was being reorganized in the heart of the storm. The 5th Ranger Group's mission was critical: coordinate with the 17th Armored Cavalry Squadron, led by Colonel Nguyen Xuan Dung, and the M48 King of Battlefields tanks of the 20th Armored Squadron under Colonel Nguyen Hu Lee, and rush to Dong Ha. Their task: relieve the Marine Brigade holding the vital bridge and defensive line. This was no ordinary handover. It was a race against time, against the steel spearheads of the enemy. Colonel Nguyen Trong Luk, commander of the 1st Cavalry Brigade, was tasked with coordinating the entire armored defense. A wall of steel was being built. The joint command post of the 5th Rangers and the 17th Cavalry was established along Highway 1, just 4 kilometers south of Dong Ha, a deadly forward position. The main defense burden fell on the 33rd Ranger Battalion under Major Ha Ki Dan. These brown beret soldiers, alongside the 5th Recon Company and a 105mm artillery battery, dug trenches, strung barbed wire, and braced for a fight to the death. To the southwest, along the rugged Trung Son foothills, Major Van Mong Thui's 30th Battalion formed a steel barrier with the M48 tanks, blocking flanking attacks. Behind them, Major's Vu Ding Kang's 38th Battalion stood ready as reserves, poised to plug any breach in the line. Meanwhile, the 4th Ranger Group under Le Col Lei Hung Fei deployed as well. Maja Tung Sun's 43rd Battalion held the northwestern approaches to I-2, an essential fire base. Maji Vu Van Thi's 44th Battalion took Phượng Hoàng Hill, a strategic position commanding vast territory. Everything unfolded with suffocating urgency. Every hour, every minute counted. Each soldier, each rifle, each tank in position could decide the fate of the entire front. This was the moment when names and unit numbers ceased to be ink on paper. They became living men, flesh and blood, facing the greatest test of their lives. They came from every corner of the country, spoke different accents, but now shared the same trench, the same orders, and perhaps the same destiny. The Dong Ha I-2 Phượng Hoàng line was no longer just a place on a map. It was a vow of the Marines, the Rangers, the cavalrymen, that they would turn this land into a wall of fire, where every enemy attack would burn and die. But across the battlefield, North Vietnam's steel divisions, fueled by unstoppable momentum, were preparing their next assault. The historic clash between the T-54 and M48 tanks was about to begin. The story of the Red Summer had only just begun, and its bloodiest chapter was about to be written. Right at the bridge of Dong Ha, the silence on the battlefield was sometimes more terrifying than the roar of bombs. It was the silence of a beast crouching, gathering all its strength before launching a deadly strike. At the Dong Ha defense line in the early days of April 1972, that silence was so thick it could almost be cut. For the soldiers of the 5th Ranger Group and the 17th Armored Cavalry Squadron, every second that passed was a mental torture. They didn't know from which direction the enemy would come, nor how powerful the next attack would be. They only knew one thing for sure: it would come. In hastily dug bunkers along the southern bank of the Mujiang River, the brown-bereted Rangers tried to catch some sleep. But sleep never came. The image of the highway of horror still haunted them. Images of civilians fleeing with children in their arms, of little ones fainting beside their dead parents, of blank stares gazing toward a homeland engulfed in flames. They, the soldiers, were the last wall separating that wave of destruction from what remained of Quang Tri, Hue, and perhaps all of South Vietnam. The burden weighed heavily on the shoulders of men barely in their 20s. Lieutenant Colonel Min Hong, commander of the 5th Ranger Group, continuously walked along the front line, his eyes fixed on the northern horizon. He knew that his forces, though elite, were too thin. They were trained for lightning raids, for jungle warfare, not for trench warfare against waves of tanks and men. But orders were orders, and the honor of a ranger would not allow retreat. On the other side, in the shadows of rubber forests and deserted villages, a massive war machine was on the move. The 24th Regiment of the 304th Glory Division of the People's Army of Vietnam, reinforced by the 203rd Tank Regiment, was quietly tightening the noose. They were battle-hardened men, veterans of the long march along the Truong Son Trail, and now their objective was the Dong Ha Steel Bridge. Capture that bridge, and the door to Quang Tri City would be wide open. The T-54 tanks, pride of the Socialist Armored Corps, were fully fueled and armed, their steel hulls disguised with branches from the forest. Behind them marched infantrymen carrying AK rifles and B-40 rocket launchers. They were in no rush. They had time, numbers, and firepower on their side. They were playing a game they believed they had already won. Then the silence was broken, not by a massive explosion, but by strange chit-chit sounds followed by white smoke trails snaking through the sky. For the first time, South Vietnamese soldiers faced a new weapon that would change the course of armored warfare: the AT-3 Sagar, or 9M14 Milyutka, wire-guided anti-tank missiles. Launched from well-hidden positions, the missiles found their marks among the M41 tanks of the 17th Armored Squadron. For tankers used to face-to-face combat, it was a shock. They couldn't see the enemy, only their own tanks bursting into flames. Colonel Nguyen Trong Luc's steel wall began to show its first cracks. That probing attack was just the overture. At 5 a.m. on April 9th, the ground began to shake. Hundreds of 130mm cannons and 122mm rockets from North Vietnamese artillery bases north of the Ben Hai River and the Truong Son Mountains roared to life. Their targets weren't just defensive positions. They hit everything still standing in Dong Ha. Hospitals, churches, schools, all were swallowed by fire. The bombardment lasted more than an hour, meant to crush morale and sever communication lines. When the shelling stopped, shadows emerged through the smoke. T-54 tanks advancing, one column then another, until an entire herd of steel beasts rolled toward the bridge. They moved like prehistoric monsters, 100mm guns pointed forward, ready to obliterate anything in their path. Infantry followed close behind, exploiting the terrain to close in on the Rangers' positions. The battle for Dong Ha Bridge had begun. The roar of tank engines merged with rifle fire, grenades, and screams, a symphony from hell. The 33rd Ranger Battalion, under Major Ha Ki Dan, fought with extraordinary courage. They knew their M16 rifles were useless against tank armor. Their only hope lay in M72 Law rockets, fragile-looking one-shot launchers. Yet in the hands of brave men, they became tank killers. Small teams of 2 or 3 Rangers would rush out of cover, waiting until a T-54 was within 50 meters before firing. A dry whoosh, a flash of fire, and another tank went up in flames. But not all made it back. Many were cut down by the 12.7mm machine guns atop the tanks or by supporting infantry before they could even pull the trigger. The fight for each meter of ground was brutal. Blood stained the asphalt road and the waters of the Miujiang River. Still, the attackers kept coming. Wave after wave of infantry and tanks from the 24th Regiment pressed forward. The 33rd Battalion was being decimated. In desperation, Lieutenant Colonel Min Hong committed his reserves, the 38th Ranger Battalion under Major Vu Din Kang. The tiger-striped soldiers of the 38th rushed to plug the gaps, pushing back several enemy assaults. But the most iconic duel of the day wasn't between infantrymen. It was between giants of steel. Realizing his infantry couldn't hold much longer, Colonel Luc made a bold move. He ordered the 1st Troop of the 20th Armored Cavalry Squadron, equipped with M48 Patton Kings of the Battlefield, to counterattack. Leading the charge was M48 Tank No. 3-1, commanded by Captain Nguyen Van Duong. It was the first tank-versus-tank battle between the 2 main battle tanks of the war, the Soviet T-54 and the American M48. Duong's M48, with its powerful 90mm gun and superior targeting system, rolled into position. Through his scope, he saw a T-54 attempting to cross the bridge. A short command echoed in his intercom: "Target! T-54, fire!" The deafening blast kicked the M48 backwards slightly. The armor-piercing shells streaked through the air and struck home. The T-54 halted, black smoke rising from its turret. It was destroyed. But the triumph was short-lived. Another T-54, hidden nearby, fired back. Its 100mm shell grazed the M48's flank, sparks flying. Both sides realized this was an even match. The tank duel at Dong Ha became legendary. The M48s, with their superior range and accuracy, turned into mobile fortresses, bolstering the Rangers' morale. They worked in perfect coordination, Rangers using M72s to destroy nearby T-54s and enemy infantry, clearing space for the Pattons to fire from distance. That day, the 1st Troop of the 20th Armored Cavalry destroyed 9 T-54s and 2 PT-76s, while suffering only minor losses. Captain Duong and his crew's valor stopped the main thrust of the 203rd Tank Regiment, forcing them to retreat. By nightfall, the North Vietnamese assault had been repelled, leaving behind dozens of burned-out tanks and hundreds of fallen soldiers. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam had held the bridge and the Dong Ha line. The gunfire faded, replaced by the cries of the wounded and the stench of gunpowder and burning flesh. The Dong Ha steel bridge still stood, scarred by bullet holes, its deck stained with oil and blood. The first battle was over, but no one believed it would be the last. They had won a battle, not the war. The price had been steep. The 33rd and 38th Ranger Battalions suffered heavy casualties. Burned-out M41 tanks lay scattered across the field. Exhaustion and sorrow marked every soot-covered face. Looking northward, they knew the enemy would return, stronger, angrier, and relentless. The Battle of Dong Ha was only the opening chapter of a longer, bloodier tragedy. Victory has a strange taste on the battlefield. It is not sweet, but salty like blood and bitter like gunpowder smoke. For the surviving soldiers of the Rangers and armored cavalry after the deadly Battle of April 9th, victory was only a temporary concept. A brief pause before the symphony of death resumed with fiercer, more furious notes. They had held the bridge, but at what cost? The 33rd Ranger Battalion was almost wiped out. Faces that had laughed just yesterday now lay buried beneath hastily dug earth. Physical exhaustion could be eased by a sip of water, a cigarette, but the mental wear was irreparable. Every soldier understood. The last battle was only a probing strike. The real knockout was still to come. In the makeshift command bunker, Luc Kong Min Hong and Colin Nguyen Trong Luc bent over a creased military map. Streams of intelligence poured in from all directions, none of it good. The attack on Dong Ha Bridge had not been an isolated thrust. It was only one pincer in a much larger coordinated campaign. To the west, the 308th Pioneer Division was storming across the Cam Lo River, striking directly at I-2 Base, headquarters of the 3rd Infantry Division. To the east, along the coast, North Vietnamese commandos and infantry were trying to cross the Qua Viet River to sever the vital coastal supply line. They had made a fatal mistake. They had focused too much on one point, the Dong Ha Bridge, without realizing that the enemy had no intention of playing by the rules. The enemy wanted to overturn the entire board. The big picture was horrifying. Their already thin forces were now stretched along a front tens of kilometers long, facing 3 main force divisions, backed by hundreds of tanks and an unprecedented density of artillery. They were no longer a wall, but a sparse fence trying to hold back a tidal wave. For the first time, Colder Luc, a veteran armored commander, felt a creeping helplessness. His M48 Pattons might be kings of the battlefield in direct combat, but they couldn't be everywhere at once. Worse, they were now facing an invisible enemy, a silent killer that had tasted blood in the first battle, the AT-3 Sagar anti-tank missile. And then, the real fury began. At dawn on April 10th, the skies over Quang Tri lost their blue. They turned crimson with fire and gray with smoke. More than 400 heavy guns, 130mm, 122mm, H-12 rocket launchers, and BM-21 Grads of the North Vietnamese Army unleashed hell on the entire defensive line. This was no longer tactical artillery support, it was systematic annihilation. The ground shook like an earthquake. The explosions blended into a single, endless roar that tore at eardrums and minds alike. The feeling of being buried alive seeped into every soldier. They could only clutch their rifles, curl up, and pray that the next shell wouldn't hit their bunker. Communication lines were cut almost instantly. Units lost contact, isolated islands amid a sea of fire. When the bombardment finally paused, a deadly silence fell, broken only by ringing ears. Then, through the haze, the old scenario repeated, only on a much larger scale. Columns of T-54 tanks rumbled forward again, but this time they didn't focus on the bridge. They spread out, coordinating with infantry to strike at every weak point in the Ranger lines. Yet, that wasn't the worst part. The true horror awaited the steel elephants of Color Luck. The North Vietnamese Army had learned their bloody lesson from the previous day's tank duel. They realized that facing the M48s head-on was suicide. Instead, they deployed dozens, even hundreds, of anti-tank hunter teams, 2 to 3 men each, armed with AT-3 Sagar missiles, hidden in bushes, ruins, and trenches. The M48 Pattons, once the pride and backbone of the defense line, suddenly turned from hunters into prey. Captain Nguyen Van Duong, the hero of the previous day, now felt the danger closing in. His M48 crawled cautiously through the shattered streets of Dong Ha, his eyes and gunners fixed on their scopes, scanning for threats. But how could one guard against an unseen enemy? Suddenly, the assistant gunner shouted, "Missile! 2 o'clock!" The crew saw a tiny white smoke trail, weaving like a deadly snake toward them. The driver instinctively jerked the controls. The massive tank lurched, but too late. A thunderous explosion shook the vehicle. The Sagar missile, with its shaped charge warhead, pierced the thick side armor. Inside, fire and molten shrapnel turned the fighting compartment into an inferno. The M48, the king of the battlefield, was now a blazing coffin. That scene repeated across the front. The once invincible M48s were being destroyed one after another by crude-looking weapons. Panic spread through the armored ranks. They didn't know where to shoot. Every bush, every wall could hide death. The steel wall Caller Luke had built was collapsing piece by piece. The soldiers' morale, already stretched thin, began to snap. Meanwhile, the Rangers were faring no better. Crushed by artillery, attacked from multiple directions by tanks and infantry, Latkal Minhong's battalions fought in despair. They resisted with everything they had, every bullet, every grenade. Bloody close-quarters combat raged in every house, every corner. But their numbers kept dwindling. One man fell, another took his place, but the gaps grew larger. Over his crackling PRC-25 radio, Min Hong shouted desperately for support. He called for artillery, but the gun crews were themselves under bombardment, unable to respond effectively. He called for air support, but the skies belonged to North Vietnam's anti-aircraft guns and SA-2 missiles. F-4 Phantoms and A-37 Dragonflies circled high, dropping bombs from afar, unable to dive lower. They were abandoned. That was the bitterest truth. They were alone, fighting and dying. By the end of April 11th, despair reached its peak. A powerful assault force from the 24th Regiment and 203rd Tank Regiment, after heavy losses at the bridge, no longer attacked head-on. They secretly crossed the river at another point, pushing deep southward to cut off the defenders' only retreat route. At the same time, news came from I-2. The base was on the verge of collapse. If I-2 fell, the entire Quang Tri defense line would crumble. In the bunker, Colonel Luke received an order he had dreaded: abandon Dong Ha, withdraw south to establish a new defensive line protecting Quang Tri City. Militarily, it was logical, but it stabbed at the pride of every man who had bled for this ground. Retreat meant that all their comrades' sacrifices over the past 2 days had been in vain. But if they didn't withdraw, the entire 5th Ranger Group and the remaining armored forces would be surrounded and annihilated. Yet, how could they retreat while the Dong Ha Bridge still stood, an open highway for enemy tanks to pour southward? A heartbreaking, heroic decision was made. The bridge must be destroyed. They would cut off their own lifeline to slow the enemy's advance. The burden fell on a combat engineer unit. Under unending artillery fire, the sappers raced toward the bridge with bundles of C4 explosives. They worked in desperation as T-54s roared ever closer. Many fell before placing the final charges. Then, a final order crackled over the radio. A deafening explosion erupted, louder than any before. The Dong Ha Steel Bridge, symbol of unyielding resistance, shuddered one last time before splitting in two and collapsing into the blood-red Mujang River. Smoke and twisted steel filled the air. For the defenders, that explosion was not a sound of victory. It was the cry of defeat. They had destroyed the very symbol they had sworn to protect. The steel wall had truly shattered. Now, nothing stood between them and the enemy's pursuit, but the river and their fading courage. The chaotic, deadly retreat began. The Red Summer had only just entered its bloodiest chapter. The explosion that destroyed Dong Ha Bridge did not merely demolish a structure of steel and iron. It shattered the spirit, the final pride of the soldiers defending it. To them, that bridge was a symbol. It marked the boundary between life and death, a testament to the sacrifice of hundreds of comrades over 48 hellish hours. Blowing it up with their own hands was like crushing their own hearts. The order to retreat, once a glimmer of hope for survival, now carried the bitter taste of defeat. They were no longer the heroic defenders of the fortress. They had become defeated men, fleeing for their lives. A brutal, naked truth. There was no time for mourning. Before the echo of the final explosion faded, the whistling of artillery shells ripped through the air once more. The enemy had realized their intent. Destroying the bridge was an act of desperation, and in war, the enemy's desperation signals the start of total assault. North Vietnamese artillery shifted fire, no longer targeting fixed positions, but systematically blanketing the narrow road leading south, Highway 1. That vital artery had become a deadly trap. The retreat began in unimaginable chaos. Discipline and command structure evaporated amid the inferno. No longer were ranks or units distinguishable. A tank colonel ran beside a ranger private. A platoon leader carried a wounded radio operator. All merged into one desperate, flowing mass of humanity heading south. But they were not alone. Among them surged thousands, tens of thousands, of civilians from Quang Tri, the elderly, women, children, their faces gaunt with fear, clinging to motorbikes, tiny trucks, or running barefoot with overloaded bundles. They had believed the army's promise that the city would be defended. Now, as soldiers fled, that faith shattered. All that remained was the instinct to run without direction, run to survive. The human river stretched for kilometers, turning Highway 1 into a tragic vision. It was no longer a road. It was a river of people, flowing in terror. Then hell truly opened. Shells from 130mm guns began raining down upon the column. Each explosion shook the earth, flinging bodies, shattered vehicles, and piercing screams skyward. A GMC truck full of soldiers took a direct hit, erupting into a fireball. No one survived. A small family in a taxi-sized lamb van was torn apart by shrapnel, leaving only a pool of blood and eternal silence. The scene became surreal. People running suddenly collapsed. Children cried for lost mothers. Names were shouted into the void. The stench of blood, cordite, and burning flesh thickened the air into something suffocating. This was the Highway of Horror. Not a name from books, but a living nightmare endured second by second. In that chaos, commanders like Colonel Nguyen Truong Luc and Lieutenant Colonel Min Hong felt a despair that gnawed to the bone. Colonel Luc, in his command jeep, shouted desperately into the radio, trying to regroup what remained of his armored battalions. It was useless. His once mighty M48 tanks and M103 armored carriers were immobilized, jammed in the crush of refugees and vehicles. They had become massive, stationary targets for enemy gunners. He saw an M113 only meters away take a mortar round. The rear hatch burst open, soldiers spilling out, some engulfed in flames, others writhing in agony. He wanted to order the remaining M48s to fire back, but at what? The enemy was everywhere and nowhere, just invisible artillery raining death from miles away. Lieutenant Colonel Min Hong faced his own tragedy. His 5th Ranger Group, once his pride, was shattered. He saw his brave Tigers throwing away heavy weapons and packs just to run faster. Some tried to hold formation, firing back at advancing North Vietnamese infantry flanking the road, but their resistance was futile, tiny sparks against a hurricane. He saw a young soldier, barely 20, fall under AK fire. His comrade tried to pull him along, but another burst struck them both. They died together, on the very road they were fleeing. Tears cut through the dust on Min Hong's face. He had failed to protect his men. The truth revealed itself in the most painful way. The retreat was not only on land. With Dong Ha Bridge gone, thousands were trapped on the northern bank of the Miaogyang River. In desperation, they tried to cross, clinging to planks, makeshift rafts, banana trunks. Soldiers stripped off uniforms and weapons, swimming through the fierce current. But the once gentle river had become a mass grave. Enemy shells pounded the water, each detonation swallowing dozens. North Vietnamese troops on the far shore fired machine guns and mortars at the swimmers. The Miaogyang turned red with blood, a true river of death. The most horrifying revelation of this retreat was not the enemy's strength, but the fragility of the line between order and chaos, between hero and coward, between human and beast. When death loomed, ideals vanished. Only raw instinct remained. There were flashes of heroism, a soldier turning back to save a comrade, a mother shielding her child from shrapnel. But there were also heartbreaking sights. People shoving others aside for a spot on a boat, the strong abandoning the wounded to save themselves. War stripped away every mask, exposing humanity at its cruelest. For hours, the nightmare dragged on. The remnants finally reached the hastily formed defensive line along the Mi Chang River. But only a fraction survived. Thousands of soldiers and civilians lay dead along that short stretch of road. The once elite units were now broken remnants, exhausted, weaponless, shattered. Yet the greatest loss was not material, it was spiritual. As night fell, Colonel Look stood on the southern bank of the meat chain, staring north. The sky still glowed red from the fires of Quang Tri. The thunder of his M48 tanks was gone forever. The steel wall had fallen. The solution at Dong Ha had led to catastrophe. They had escaped one trap, only to stumble into another, far worse. The battle for Quang Tri had just begun. But for those who survived the highway of horror, their war was already over, ended in defeat and humiliation. A single haunting question burned in every survivor's mind. Open quote, "Did the sacrifice of our comrades mean anything when we left everything behind?" Close quote. When the last gunfire of the night faded into nothingness, the silence that enveloped the Michang River bank did not bring peace. It was a heavy silence, thick with the smell of gunpowder, death, and an unnameable sense of loss. The retreat had ended. Hell had, for the moment, closed its gates. But for the survivors, another hell. The hell of memory had just begun. They had escaped physical death, but a part of their souls seemed forever left behind on that fateful road called the Highway of Horror. They were no longer soldiers of elite divisions, no longer the tigers of the jungles or the iron elephants of the battlefield. Now they were merely survivors, burdened with the weight of memory and a tormenting question. Why me and not them? Colonel Nguyen Trong Look sat down on a mound of earth, his helmet beside him. His hands, the same hands that had once issued iron commands to an entire armored regiment, now trembled uncontrollably. He could no longer see his mighty M48 tanks. The steel wall that he and his comrades had built, the pride of an entire corps, was now just a bitter phrase. It had not been crushed by enemy fire. It had melted, shattered within its own retreat. He closed his eyes, and the images returned vividly. Burning M113s, his soldiers falling, the screams of civilians. This was not a tactical defeat. It was a collapse of spirit, a bankruptcy of faith. He, the commander, had failed to protect his men, failed to hold the land they had sworn to defend with their lives. What had changed most in him was not the loss of weapons or equipment, but the fracture of military pride. From a confident leader, he had become a man confronting the naked truth of limitation and helplessness. Not far away, Lieutenant Colonel Min Hung walked among what was left of his rangers. He said nothing. He simply patted one shoulder, squeezed another hand. His 5th Ranger Group, once the terror of the enemy, now could be counted on his fingers. Every face he saw was missing familiar brothers. He noticed a young soldier sobbing uncontrollably, clutching his empty rifle. The boy was not crying out of fear, but because he had left his best friend behind on the road. Min Hung sat down beside him, saying nothing, just placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. In that moment, he was no longer a commander. He was a father, a brother, sharing a pain too deep for words. His journey, from fearless commander to witness of tragedy, was complete. He realized the greatest victory of a leader was not in how many objectives were captured, but in how many of his men he could bring home. And today, he had failed miserably. But the story did not end with personal grief. The fall of Quang Tri and the horrific retreat sent shockwaves far beyond the battlefield. It was not merely the loss of a province. It was the collapse of an entire strategic line that had taken years to build. It revealed a brutal truth. The imbalance in firepower, especially artillery, had reached a level that no courage could compensate for. It also exposed the fragility of morale, showing that even the most elite units could disintegrate once discipline and command structure were broken. The message of this tragedy was clear. The war had entered a new phase, more brutal, more merciless, leaving no room for illusions. So, were all those sacrifices meaningless? The soldiers who fell on the highway of horror, the civilians who died unjustly, was their blood spilled in vain? Judging by the immediate outcome, a total military defeat, the answer might seem yes, but history is never a straight line. Tragedy does not only leave pain, it leaves lessons written in blood. The first and most painful lesson is the lesson of truth. The truth that war is not made of glorious reels of film. It is blood, tears, chaos, and merciless cruelty. The highway of horror stripped away all illusions, forcing those who lived it and the world to face the real face of war. It was no longer a war of strategists on maps. It was a tragedy of individual human lives. The second lesson is one of rebirth from ashes. It was precisely the pain and humiliation of this retreat that sparked another kind of determination. It became an obsession, a debt to be repaid. For the surviving soldiers, returning to Quang Tri was no longer an order. It became a vow of honor. From the ashes of the April defeat, an extraordinary resolve was forged, and just months later, it would ignite into the 81-day battle to retake Quang Tri Citadel, one of the fiercest confrontations of the entire war. Thus, the sacrifice on the highway of horror was not meaningless. It became the seed of later courage. Their blood watered the soil from which a stronger will would grow. The final and deepest message is about human legacy. Years later, when bombs had stopped falling, when wounds had turned to scars, what remained were not casualty numbers or military reports. What remained were the stories. Stories of the mother shielding her child from bullets, of the soldier turning back to save a comrade, of the commanders weeping in helplessness, and even of cowardice and selfishness in the face of death. All those fragments formed a true portrait of human nature under the harshest circumstances. The legacy of the Highway of Horror does not lie in who won or lost. Its legacy lives in the nation's memory, a scar that never heals, a perpetual reminder of war's futility and cruelty. Open quote. War does not end when the guns fall silent. It ends only when its last memory fades away. The Highway of Horror, the Thakhan River, the Quang Tri Citadel, they are not just places on a map. They are collective graves, witnesses of an era where the line between life and death was thinner than a thread. The story of the retreat from Quang Tri is not one of defeat. It is the story of the price of peace. And it leaves us, those who came after, with a question hanging in the air. Have we learned anything from the tragedies written in the blood and tears of our fathers? Or will we let new highways of horror appear again in history, under another form, in another place? Close quote.